To get started, thank you again for joining. And my name is Mitch. I am a gay cisgender man, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in the future. But I use he, him, and his pronouns. I'm originally from Bismarck, North Dakota. I grew up in the Midwest until I left for college and have then bounced around the country. I primarily am a health disparities, primarily LGBTQ plus health related researcher, but I do see patients. I'm a nephrologist, a kidney disease doctor, and see patients for about 6 weeks per year on the inpatient consult service at Stanford. And then I also am a primary care provider, and I take care of exclusively LGBTQ plus patients in Stanford's LGBTQ plus health program. And about half of my patients or so are gender minority patients, patients who are transgender, non-binary, or gender expansive, and I help manage their transition, which can include hormones, gender-affirming hormone therapy, or getting them over to the correct surgeons for gender-affirming surgeries. And for folks who are blind or have low vision, I'm a white guy. I'm wearing a light blue button-down shirt, have kind of long wavy hair and a little bit of facial hair, and I have a pride flag background for my Zoom today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Juno.
Thank you so much, Mitch. My name is Juno Obedin-Maliver. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a white Jewish cisgender queer woman. And as Gage mentioned, I'm an obstetrician gynecologist. I spend 70% of my time doing community engaged research on LGBTQ plus health equity, health disparities, and the rest of my time is in clinical practice as a generalist OB/GYN. So helping people across the gender spectrum with their sexual and reproductive health needs. That means doing surgery, helping deliver babies, doing hysterectomies, doing abortions, the full gamut of care provision. And here, for those who may be visually impaired or have low vision, I am white appearing, short hair, and wearing a black and white shirt. So with that, we're going to go on and talk about what today's talk is about. So the big picture overview of what we're going to cover is a little bit of an introduction to sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex assigned at birth. With that, to give context for a health framing, we're going to talk about some health disparities experienced by sexual and or gender minority people, and hopefully inspire you to think about how you can be active in whatever your professional and personal disciplines to help diminish health disparities and move towards health equity, but also to help set that up for thinking about sexual and gender minority people in research and some context for the All of Us research program, some other research that's been published. And then we hope to spend a good amount of time talking about example questions that can be tackled with the All of Us research program control tier data, which is a very unique opportunity, both for elucidating the health of sexual and or gender minority people, as well as both an opportunity and a caution for all researchers of how to think about sexual orientation and gender identity variables, or abbreviated SOGI, which is critical for accuracy in all of our research and with all of us research program projects. All right, so next slide for our objectives. We hope that we will help accomplish these goals, which are providing tools for an understanding of how to accurately use these data elements that we're talking about, providing a foundational understanding of some of the considerations for sexual and or gender minority people and their health disparities, and then thinking about how all of us control tier data must be used presents a unique opportunity. And as I said, some cautionary notes as well. So with that, we'll go into talking about these three key data elements: sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex assigned at birth. As Mitch and I mentioned, we're both members of what we call LGBTQ plus or SGM communities, communities. Though I would venture most people on this call have heard of those terms or know what they mean, it's really important that we kind of level set and give you a little bit of an idea of why we chose to devote our lives and our research careers to helping to serve this community that can be underserved, understudied, and vulnerable to poor health. Next slide. So the population in part that we're talking about, because again, these data elements apply to everybody, but when we're thinking about sexual and or gender minority people, what we're talking about is people who are not exclusively heterosexual or not cisgender. what do those terms mean? Well, we're going to talk about that in a second, but this kind of dovetails with the term LGBTQ+, which is what's used commonly, sort of in media, politics, even in research, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, among others. LGBTQ+ includes both sexual orientation terms and gender identity terms, which I'll talk about, and is used somewhat interchangeably with this more academic term, sexual and/or gender minority people, which is used in academia, and also the NIH has used this term, and has been described as folks who are not heterosexual, meaning not exclusively attracted to or identifying with or having sex with people of the quote unquote opposite gender, which is a little bit of a fallacy because there's more than two genders, okay? And cisgender people who are individuals who current gender identity is consistent with that commonly associated with their sex assigned at birth. So Mitch and I both introduced ourselves as cisgender people. I'm a cisgender woman. I was assigned female sex at birth. Somebody looked at my body parts and basically said, that looks like a female human, uterus, ovaries, and tubes, and some other parts as well, and identify as a woman today. And that is different from gender minority people whose gender identity may differ from that commonly associated with their sex assigned at birth. So important to say here, there's a lot of different terms. We use the term LGBTQ, LGBT, and SGM interchangeably. They're not exactly interchangeable, but that's kind of a whole other talk. And there's many other identities besides just LGBTQ. And the NIH actually recognizes sexual and gender minority people as those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, transgender, two-spirit, queer, and/or intersex. All really important communities. And then we have often the plus to signify there's even many more. So various researchers and studies assess sexual orientation, gender identity, sex assigned at birth differently and talk about them differently. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But assessing sexual and/or gender minority status and/or being LGBTQ plus or not generally comes down to a few data elements. And I'm going to talk about those now. So the first fundamental concept is sex assigned at birth. So not the behavior, but kind of talking about phenotypic presentation versus gender. So sex assigned at birth, I want to give you this definition, which is the biological, anatomic, and/or physiological characteristics that define males and females and people of differences of sex development of our species. So this is where I, as an obstetrician, look at somebody even before birth, the developing fetus, and may look actually, frankly, between their legs. And if I see dangly bits, I wouldn't actually label that as boy, I would say male as the phenotypic presentation, because that's a sex assigned at birth. And boy, on contrast, would be a gender identity term or gender term. So that's in contrast, sex assigned at birth, in contrast to gender. Gender is the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, attributes that a given society considers appropriate for men, women, and/or people of other genders, and there are many different genders. And this is variable to a certain time, place, culture, society, region of the world, etc. And gender is further broken down into gender identity, what someone holds inside of their own mind and experience, versus gender expression, clothes wear, physical features, etc. So terms are really important to get right. They're often conflated in medicine and research, but they're not the same thing, and we have to use them distinctively because they are different. Next slide. So a good tool, and this is just a tool, is the gender unicorn. Everyone has a gender unicorn, and some people think, this is maybe a diminutive way to talk about it. And I don't mean to be diminutive here, and this is not child's play, but everyone has a gender unicorn inside of them, and it's easy to remember as kind of a tool. These are 5 domains that the gender unicorn has. There are actually some domains missing, but I've already touched on a few of them. If we look at the gender unicorn, it signifies the top kind of row with the little rainbow thought bubble is gender identity. And that's something that you can only know if you ask someone and if they feel comfortable telling you, right? It lives inside their own mind and experience. And that may or may not correlate with somebody's gender expression, the clothes they wear, their hair, their makeup, their vocal intonations, whether they cross their legs or not, how they do that, how they walk. All of these things are culturally relevant and may reflect how a certain society reads people with respect to their gender expression. I'll note that on gender identity, gender expression, and then these others that I'm getting to, that there are arrows which signify that there is sort of a spectrum of experience and that people may be at different places and that there's more than two of each of these. Those are all different than sex assigned at birth, represented here by a little chromosome and kind of placed over the genital area. Sex assigned at birth, as I said, relates to anatomy, physiology, genes, chromosomes, but is not just related to the genitalia, but is often sort of thought about in terms of genitalia. But we know that these sex assigned at birth and chromosomes can, affect all of our cells actually. And that is distinct from who somebody might be sexually attracted to, romantically and emotionally attracted to or engaged with. And what's not here at all is behavior. So who someone is having sex with. So whereas the blue greens on the top are really gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth in the middle, and then the orange, red, and the missing behavior piece are sexual orientation. There's a lot to think about, but the point is that we need to disaggregate these elements, and that sex or sex assigned at birth is sort of a shortcut is what's in your genes, as in your chromosomes or your blue genes, and gender identity is kind of what's between your ears or in your mind. Okay, so that's a shortcut. It's not perfect, but that's a shortcut. And then another kind of quick shortcut is gender identity is who you go to bed as, who you think of as yourself. And then that's distinct from sexual orientation, which is who you go to bed with, or again, how you identify who you're attracted to. Shortcut rubrics, but just to delineate those two. All right. So as we think about this, we have to think about, how does this all play out in research and medicine? And amazingly and importantly, the All of Us research program assesses those different elements: gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and sexual orientation in research. But most research doesn't, and most medicine doesn't consider this. And so where we're starting from in medicine is actually at a different place where many of these things are conflated. So let's talk about that. What does someone who's having a heart attack look like in medicine or in science research? If you're like me, when I went to med school, the picture looked like this. So a white, presumably cisgender man clutching his heart, probably coming out of a restaurant, eating a rich meal, and a distribution down the arm in this way. But what we've learned in medicine is we now know better. We actually know, next please, that gosh, cisgender women get heart attacks too, right? Actually, everyone does. Duh, everyone has a heart. So what we've learned, though, especially recently, is that the symptoms are different between cisgender men and cisgender women, and they present differently. Okay, next slide, please. So we know that the differences in presentation, in treatment, and outcome actually come from a constellation of both differences in sex, so hormones, physiology, anatomy, and gender, as well as race, as well as many other factors that all influence people's risk factors, diagnosis, treatment, prevention, and outcomes. Okay, so that's been sort of well appreciated now, that there's differences between cisgender men and cisgender women, and that race, ethnicity, region, age, all of these things influence. But the distinction between kind of thinking across gender identities and across sexual orientations is really poorly studied still. So to illustrate that for a moment, I'm going to say, what does a pregnant person look like and support people look like? For most of us, it looks like this. So I actually don't know these people, took it off the internet. My apologies to these people if I'm getting things wrong, but presumably this couple is a white appearing straight cisgender couple. Again, I don't know actually. But these are the kinds of images that we think of when we see a pregnant person and support people. But why not have an image like this in our mind? Next slide. So here we see two gay men. One is transgender man, one is a cisgender man. And you might think, well, gosh, proportionally, I would be right if I was thinking of the other image. And that probably has something to do with it. But like heart attacks in women, people of many genders can be pregnant. And we just haven't been socially, culturally trained to expect it to happen, much less that, two gay men one could be pregnant and raising a kid together. And so We know, for example, that cisgender Black women have 3 to 4 times the mortality of cisgender white women in pregnancy. We have no idea how that translates into people across genders and sexual orientations, really. So, and then that next slide goes to considerations of infant feeding and parenting and throughout the life course. It even influences our medicine. So this is a nausea and vomiting medicine in pregnancy called diclegis, and you can see it has racialized components as well as gendered components, certainly. So with all of that in mind, thank you for that kind of tour into mental models and how they might limit us. Most of these mental models that we carry around need to be observed, challenged, and unlearned. And these mental models drive health disparities. So next slide. Because data on sexual orientation, gender identity, sex assigned at birth aren't comprehensively included in epidemiological and research efforts, LGBTQ plus health and health disparities are poorly characterized. And that's in part driven by the fact that researchers and clinicians don't ask about these data elements, which then leads to a lack of LGBTQ plus health data, which then drives that these disparities persist because they're just sort of invisible and we can't address them. And around we go. So in research, we're perfectly situated to actually interrupt this cycle. And actually, the All of Us research program is really different in that it has the tools, really powerful tools, to help us, combined with researchers doing their work, to interrupt this cycle. So next slide. Most studies have really done a disservice to LGBTQ people by making them invisible in research and or by conflating sexual orientation, gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and actually organs and other experiences. But AOU is different. It disaggregates and asks these questions separately so that we can start to really understand the experiences of different populations, and recognizes that sexual and or gender minority people are a population of interest because they are what the program likes to refer to as UBR populations, or a population that's underrepresented in biomedical research. So this is an unparalleled opportunity for understanding LGBTQ plus people, but these data elements really need to be understood so that we don't make errors in how we use them. So we'll come back to this, but for a moment, I just want to give it over to Mitch to really talk a little bit more about health disparities among SGM people.
Great. Thanks, Juno. So, I think as we continue to set the stage about the experiences of SGM people in healthcare, it's important to understand, how the medicine with a capital M has been discriminatory to LGBT people for many decades, and that really affects, the care that they receive and their trust and comfort with interacting with the healthcare system, but also interacting in research and participating in programs like the All of Us research program. So, we oftentimes get asked about how many LGBT people are there in the world, and the short answer is that we don't know, because these data elements are not collected in many national places such as the census. But we do have data from Gallup. Gallup, as you may know, is a polling agency. They do random digit dialing, and they call people every day and ask them a variety of questions. Sometimes people get asked about if they're part of the LGBT community. And this is data from 2021 that was released in early 2022, and we know that overall more than 7% of the United States adults identify to a random person calling them on the phone. They'll tell them that they are LGBT, and so that is an increasing proportion. Not that there are more LGBT people, but largely society is changing, where people feel more comfortable being out and answering affirmatively to that question. Among Generation Z, people who are the adults that were born, now after 1997, so 1997 to 2003, we see that 1 in 5, nearly 21% of folks identify as LGBT, and among the transgender population, among Generation Z, now more than 2% of Generation Z identifying as transgender. So there's really large numbers of LGBT people across the country. So this is a relevant and important population for research and for the All of Us research program. It is important to note that LGBT status is not unique to a particular race or ethnicity, income, region or education level, as we usually say, LGBT people are everywhere and in every county and city of this country. So there's also the importance that LGBT health and politics are currently intertwined. There's a huge amount of state bills that are on the rise. You can see the graph on the left shows an increased number of bills in the past just even 5 years or so that are showing up in state legislatures. And so this is really becoming a politicized issue. People are making, lots of issues to take away people's rights and to be, really detrimental to people's healthcare and well-being in society. We now even have more recent numbers that there's, now more than 300 different of these bills coming up. And then, of course, people may have been familiar with the most recent overruling from the Supreme Court that overruled Roe v. Wade that will have implications for LGBT people, will have implications, of course, for many other people, many pregnant people, etc. But there was also maybe unveiled threat in there that other things like same-sex sexual activity and same-sex marriage, which have been previously protected, may be next on the docket for the Supreme Court. So there's a lot going on right now. This is clearly a hot topic. From a disparity perspective, it is important to note that SGM status or homosexuality was actually a mental health disorder, a psychiatric disorder until 1973, when it was officially removed from the manual of diagnoses. They called it DSM. But gender dysphoria is a diagnosis that still remains in the current DSM. It used to be called gender identity disorder, and it's moved away from being a disorder to just having dysphoria or stress, but this is still rather pathologizing. And then as we think about genomics, which is obviously very important in the All of Us program, but thinking back to the Human Genome Project in the 90s and early 2000s, there was at that point a hunt for a gay gene or a hunt for a trans gene, that this was actually a genetic mutation that could be fixed or eradicated. And so, of course, that is not the case, but this was a lot of negative work for the community. And then people may also be familiar with reparative or conversion therapy. This is sometimes nicknamed pray the gay away. And these are therapy I usually put in quotes because it does nothing but is shown to be harmful to folks. It was ways to, in attempts to correct people's sexual orientation or gender identity to be heterosexual and cisgender. This is now outlawed in many states across the country because it's shown to do nothing but harm. We also know from the largest survey of transgender people, which will actually be repeating itself soon in the next year or so, from the US Transgender Survey, the two orange bars here on the left, a third of folks have had negative experiences with a healthcare provider in the past year, and nearly a quarter of folks have not seen their healthcare provider due to fear of mistreatment. And we have similar data among the LGBTQ plus letters as well. People have negative experiences in the doctor's office. They never come and see us, and they present really with late stage presentations of cancers and other diseases because they've either experienced mistreatment or discrimination or have anticipated that they would be subject to that. And then another large disparity is smoking. So LGBT people smoke 2/3 more than the general population. So 1 in 3 smoke among the LGBT population compared to 1 in 5 spending billions of dollars a year and taking many years of life off of our communities. And this was due to specific targeting from the tobacco industry, had specific kind of underground campaigns to specifically target the community. This is a rather sobering statistic that 41% of transgender people have attempted suicide compared to 1.6% of the general population, and it is not being transgender that makes you suicidal, but of course is instead this societal stigma and discrimination that people experience that leads to poor mental health outcomes and has a large opportunity for intervention and for, of course, improved policies and laws to help protect people. And then the bottom here is the number of homeless youth in this country. I mentioned earlier that now more than 7% of adults identify as LGBT. We actually think it's probably more than 7% of youth identifying as LGBT, something at least more like 20% or so. And when youth are experiencing either an unsafe home environment, they may get kicked out of their house or they may leave their house for their own safety and end up homeless or marginally housed. And so at least 40% of the youth in this country who are homeless are identifying as LGBT. And in places like San Francisco, where we are, which is obviously known as a LGBT mecca or safe haven, we know that number is actually much higher than 40%, and it exceeds actually 50% here. So, and then of course, COVID, people may have heard of it. It's been around for a little while, but has really affected multiple communities who have been underserved, and the LGBT community is also one of them. Has resulted in various barriers to healthcare, instability in both housing, jobs, and food. And then people have dealt with stress in a variety of ways, including, more unhealthy behaviors, and have delayed care in other ways that have resulted in notable impact. And of course, the challenge here is that we don't have national data about LGBTQ plus people. We don't know where LGBT people live. We don't know their races and ethnicities. We don't know their ages, their religions, what they do for fun, what their families are like, any of those things, because sexual orientation and gender identity are not and have not been collected on the US Census. It was initially planned for the 2020 census and removed under the Trump administration. So we hope to have this back in 2030, which will allow us to have really broad, appropriate epidemiologic sampling frames, and larger federal studies can start to better characterize the health of LGBTQ plus people. But the All of Us research program is doing this already, which is excellent. And part of I think, one of the reasons why LGBT people are included in such a meaningful way in the All of Us research program is this designation from the NIH in late 2016, which was designating LGBTQ plus people as a health disparity population for research purposes. And so this has really opened the doors, and of course has included SGM people in the UBR definition. I'm going to skip this for now, but this is just a little bit about our group. But we do basically community engagement for several projects. One of our big ones, of course, is AOU, and we engage LGBTQ plus people nationally for this. We do a variety of engagement-related efforts, including events that get people excited and educated about the program. We train the consortium on cultural competency. We hold lectures and seminars like this one that you're attending today, and we make sure that the questions that the program is asking, as well as the policies, procedures, forms, recruitment materials, et cetera, are all really welcoming and affirming to LGBTQ plus communities. We run our own social media for LGBTQ plus people for the All of Us research program, and bring people to joinallofus.org in order to join the program. And happy to say that nearly 10% of the All of Us cohort right now is identifying as LGBTQ plus. And really, there's a huge amount of value for SGM populations that All of Us is bringing. The first thing is that we're collecting, these data elements, sexual orientation, gender identity, sex assigned at birth, on all 1 million people. So this is going to be the largest data set of LGBTQ plus people that exists in the world. That is going to allow us to make comparisons between the non-SGM communities, but also comparing within the groups. How do gay men and bisexual men compare on a particular health outcome? That will now be part of it. And of course, the numerous different data elements, genomics, EHR data, survey data, wearables, et cetera, is going to be really monumental. Of course, SGM people are involved at all phases, including the AOU senior leadership, to participants, participant ambassadors, to awardees, to staff members, some who may be on this call today, to those that are participating in the program itself. And so this has really allowed All of Us to create a welcoming environment for SGM people, including, as you can see on the side here, some pages that are specifically related to SGM people that are on joinallofus.org, and then the many data types and the importance of returning data to the community. This, I think, is familiar to most everybody on the call, but just obviously the various data types are really important to create a diverse data set that allows researchers to examine many components of health disparities. And of course, as Francis Collins says, this is one of the most ambitious research efforts that our nation has ever undertaken. So everybody who's a part of it, whether you're a participant, a staff member, should be proud to participate in this event, in this really monumental program. And so now we'd like to just transition to actually some considerations for using controlled tier data. And I'm going to start and then turn it back over to Juno. And so, of course, we're now at the controlled tier, the gray tier here, which is, now having not obvious information about participants, but having a lot more information than the registered tier, where some of these data elements, which were considered sensitive, were suppressed or had some data generalizations. And so now with the controlled tier data, we have really granularity of these gender identity, sexual orientation, and sex assigned at birth data elements that are very helpful. And so the questions really are, what is the data that's collected? And again, just We showed these briefly earlier, Juno did. On the left-hand side are really the questions that people are asked in the program. And again, all 1 million people are asked these data elements. So we get people's gender identity, where people can also drill down a little bit. They get that submenu in the bottom part of that cell. People get asked their sex assigned at birth, and they get asked their sexual orientation, and again, can drill down or even provide write-ins if their answer choice is not available from the program, which is all very helpful. And this is really, again, allowing us to do many, many different things from an LGBT health researcher perspective, but also really going to really help with addressing some of those health disparities that we don't have details on. Looking at number 2 on this list is how can we identify cisgender and transgender populations in all of us? And then number 3 will be kind of what should you think about, and Juno will take that one. But how to identify populations is a challenge, and this is something that we struggle with even as LGBTQ plus health researchers. And so we've created this table, and this will be part of part of an All of Us demonstration project that's being done in the controlled tier. So this will be publicly available and available for others to use. And we've created these various, basically 6 SGM related comparison groups. You can see the first 6 rows of this table. The bottom 2 rows of the table are the cisgender heterosexual or the non-SGM folks, and how we've basically binned them into these groups for comparison based on their answers to gender identity, to sex assigned at birth, and sexual orientation from the basics PPI module. So this will be hopefully a tool that others will be able to use and that the program can kind of use consistently when drawing comparisons. And this will, of course, be beneficial for researchers who are comparing either within SGM communities or SGM to non-SGM. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Juno to do some deeper dive into some of these elements and some of the nuances.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for that tour de force there and getting us to this point. We thought it might be helpful to walk through some examples. These are not real studies, but just to show you how we as researchers might think about and use the data elements in AOU to construct studies. Again, the opportunities here as well as the cautionary tales. So I've placed a QR code here. You can use that, or in the chat, there's a PDF that actually expands these study examples and the tables that I'll be talking about that might be more helpful than the very small table that I'm going to show you on the next screen. So, if we use the study example here of uterine cancer and smoking. So, and the question, for example, was what's the relationship between smoking and endometrial cancer? Now, the inclusion criteria would be, other than being in the All of Us research program generally, would be having had a uterus, either currently or in the past. And that's different. That's a biological, physiological characteristic that's different than somebody's gender identity. I'm going to get into that in a moment. But some considerations in this study. We know that smoking prevalence varies among people of different genders. Historically in research, it's only been presumably or presumptively cisgender men and cisgender women that have been compared. But we actually think that that extends. Probably there are differences across people of many different genders in terms of the proportion who are smoking and perhaps reasons for smoking, et cetera. Now, the All of Us research program collects gender identity, again, how someone thinks about themselves, as distinct from biological, physiological characteristics, which are denoted by sex assigned at birth, and also collects smoking data and cancer data. Okay, so endometrial cancer can only occur in people who've had a uterus. And people who are assigned female sex at birth are likely to have been born with a uterus. It's a whole other talk about how sex assigned at birth may or may not map onto organs exactly, but we're going to say that those are equivalent for right now. Now, people of different genders, cisgender women, transgender men, non-binary people, may have been assigned female sex at birth, have or have had a uterus and can get endometrial cancer, and may have different risk factors, outcomes, experiences with treatment, et cetera. So given available data in AOU, biological sex assigned at birth, which is the variable that's used in AOU, should be used to collect the base sample, not gender identity. So you would not want to just select, for example, women. You would want to use biological sex assigned at birth, should be used to create your base sample. However, you do want to think about how gender identity, gender experience might influence care, right? And so gender identity should also be considered in your study and in your analyses. So we'll go to the next slide so we can talk through that a little bit. So here we have a sample table. Again, this is a made-up study, but just to illustrate some features of how we would set this up. Again, the QR code, same PDF link that's in the chat. And here on the left, I have some example study variables of things that, could reasonably contribute to as risk factors or experiences of having uterine cancer, things like age, race, ethnicity, education, smoking, etc. And then we have sexual orientation, which is expanded with the variables that are included in the program's basics section, and then sex assigned at birth. But what's in the variables in the gray on the bottom are medical conditions and experiences that could be reasonably noted to contribute to uterine cancer. That's not really what we're focusing on here. But what I want to take you to is kind of the rest of the columns. And here we've partitioned out the three probably biggest categories of people who would be at risk for uterine cancer. So cisgender women, so people who identify as a woman and were assigned female sex at birth, transgender men, people who live and move in the world as men and are men, but who were assigned female sex at birth, and then gender expansive people, folks who may not identify with being a man or woman or exclusively that, who were assigned female sex at birth. So the key element here is having a uterus, but that experience and risk factors around endometrial cancer differ and could differ. And so we would want to do research to look at that. Okay. If we had just selected women for our base population, a few things would happen. We would miss transgender men and gender expansive people who are assigned female at birth. And then we would also include women who were assigned male sex at birth, people who we usually as researchers characterize as transgender women, and therefore never had a risk of endometrial cancer. And we would be messing with sort of our base population, right? And our denominator in essence. So now to kind of contrast that with another example, this is about smoking and clinic visits. So here, the question is, what's the relationship between being a smoker and frequency of clinical visits? So anyone can smoke, sadly, and everyone hopefully at some point has seen a doctor or will or a healthcare provider. Okay, so inclusion criteria, there's none beyond basic AOU participation, and then considerations. We know that there are differences by gender historically of patterns of smoking and also differences in clinical encounters, and that may be tied to physical experiences like the likelihood to get pregnant or need birth control is different in people with certain body types than others. And that may be distinct from people's genders, okay? And so thinking about all of that and putting that together, we'll go to the next slide and look at this table, where here the table looks very different, okay? So again, leftmost column, risk factors, some things that may be associated with going to the doctor or healthcare provider or not. And then across the top, what I'm noting here is different genders, okay? So we have two columns for men. There's some men who are cisgender, they were assigned male sex at birth. There's some men who are transgender, they were assigned female at birth. Non-binary people can be assigned female or male at birth, and then women who can be either cisgender or transgender. And so here we're disaggregating genders and kind of thinking about the characteristics among those gender groups. And then we would map that according to their risk factors and experiences. So these are just two examples of how we would then take those data elements, and it would be really critical to track how these different experiences are across these different data elements. Otherwise, we would be missing people. If we lumped everyone, all women together, we would be missing how that their organs, their physiological experience, their sex assigned at birth might be influencing that experience, for example. So with that, to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, I'll just go to kind of these general principles. Obviously, any of these kind of considerations could be a whole many lectures or course in and of itself, but just some principles we wanted to leave you with, which is, making sure that the group that you're selecting for your research and the data elements make sense together. So think about that uterine cancer example. It's not about women, it's about people with a uterus. And then you have to think about how gender maps onto that experience, right? we need to make sure to consider whether and how gender versus sex assigned at birth are important variables in the analysis. So we were hoping that example 2 speaks to that. So we need to consider both elements there. It's actually a whole population question, but we want to meaningfully think about groups together and in comparison to one another. We want to determine a priori how groups will be compared and grouped together. So if you're thinking of, you have to have a rationale, like why are you comparing one group to another? So that's always true in research, but you got to think about how gender identity, sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, other features might play in or not. And that there's a difference, and this we really didn't get into much, but there's a difference between self-identification and classification by researchers. So there are a lot of people that we as researchers may, for example, consider transgender people who do not walk around with that identity. They are men, they are women, they're non-binary people, but and they may have been assigned female sex at birth, male sex at birth, but they don't use that label of transgender walking around in the world. And so that's an important thing, and we have to really honor and respect who people are to make sure that our data and our research is real, relevant, and respectful, as well as rigorous. And as kind of related to that, electronic health record data, medicine historically has not captured LGBTQ plus people and or sexual orientation, gender identity, sex assigned at birth elements well. The gold standard isn't even well defined. And a lot of the terms used in electronic health record data are really inaccurate and pathologizing. And so you have to be very careful as you're looking at EHR data elements. Are you actually doing the analyses you want to do? We didn't talk about the next element at all really much, but sexual identity is distinct from behavior. So for example, many cisgender lesbian women will have sex with people with penises or with men. That doesn't change their identity, but it does change, for example, the risk of pregnancy. I use a lot of pregnancy examples because I'm an OBGYN, but just hang with me there. So you have to be versatile on how you're distinguishing these different elements. You have to consider how your results are presented. And then, of course, people have multiple experiences, identities that influence their health, whether that's race, ethnicity, age, region of the country, religion, the language they speak, etc. And so being SGM or not is just one element, important element, but not the only element to consider. And we really have to get versatile in thinking about intersectional identities. And so with that, a few minutes left, we'll go to Q&A. And also, I'll just say we're always available to think through with people of how to use this incredible resource and others for doing research that's real, relevant, and respectful for all of our communities.
So yeah, we're happy to take questions. People can either come off of mute, they can raise their hand, they can put them in the chat. Any of these things are all options. And thanks, Margaret, for putting the link to a handout that our team created a while ago, which is a good reference for a lot of the topics that were discussed today. So I'm going to throw our email addresses in the chat, which is another way to reach us, or you can figure out how to reach PrideNet. There's many ways to reach us, and your comments or questions can get shuttled to the right folks. We're always happy to discuss this approach with folks. I would want to just share a couple take-home points to wrap up at the end, and I think I think what we've shown is that there's a fair amount of data that LGBT people are underserved and understudied, and all of us is of course starting to change that by having such a high priority of diverse communities and those who are underrepresented in research. Our group works with the AOU every day to help conduct national community engagement and improve program and the experiences of folks. It is really important that as papers and as you're either doing your own research or helping other researchers in the Workbench, that these data elements of gender identity and sex assigned at birth especially are considered, obviously sexual orientation as well, but there can be really large differences in the sample that you've selected in the cohort builder based on how you correctly define people based on their self-reported identities. And I think the key thing is that LGBT people have largely been invisibilized in research for quite a long time. And so now we have, with all the papers that will be coming out of all of us and all the help of the literature, is that we can all, even if you're doing a study on, diabetes in people between what ages, that you can show the sexual orientation, the gender identity, and sex assigned at birth in those table ones that describe the participant characteristics in non-LGBT focused or intended studies, now including sexual orientation, gender identity as key demographics, along with people's education, age, geography, income, those sorts of things. So this will actually really help increase visibility. And so for any projects that you help with or that you advise upon, I would encourage you to encourage the researchers to take a broader view of demographics and expand their table one, because this will start increasing visibility of this underserved population. So thank you all.
Question.
Oh, please.
So for that table you displayed, Mitch, that had like the kind of the proper way to distinguish people's different gender identities, you said it would be available as a workbook or a notebook?
Yeah. So proper way is, this is like always up for debate, right? It is the way we've done it, and in a way that I think is one that is pretty accepted in the community for creating those different comparison groups, and how to use people's PPI data to bin people, categorize them into a group. That will be part of a workbook in the demonstration project that we're currently finishing up. So that will be available soon as well for people, and maybe an appropriate model for others when trying to combine groups. Yeah.
Do you know when it will be available?
No,
I'll probably do my own anyway, but
I don't know
like exactly what I want to do.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think some of it, Sid Nambiar may already have some of it, but if you want to reach out to him, but you can also just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to, I can share that exact table with you, and we can talk a little bit more about getting you some code for that particular distinction.
Thank you.
Yeah, and much better than EHR data, as Juno mentioned. So thanks, Mika, for adding my email address there. Other questions or concerns or comments? Thanks, Phoebe.
There's also a brief evaluation if people feel it's really helpful to us.
Yes, that would be great if you could fill out the link that Juno put there. I'll put the QR code back up on the screen if people want to QR that. That's an easy way to get to the evaluation. That would be very helpful.
I had a comment. First off, great talk, both of you. So thank you. The other question I had, to me, I think this is like a great starting point if you want to think about these concepts with respect to any kind of analyses, right? Particularly that with all of us Workbench. Even from you or from others, do you guys have like other ideas about resources people could access that might help them sort of expand on this a little bit and think more about it, and help them, I guess, think about how to include LGBTQ+ people in their analyses? And if so, actually, just FYI too, maybe we can talk about this more after. Maybe we can link to some of those on all of this help desk site too. But if there's any that offhand, that might be really helpful too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there is the one resource, the PDF that's 4 pages that Margaret linked to in the chat, which is one that's already on the Workbench, which is a good resource. The other resource, frankly, is us, and it's part of our award to provide technical assistance to folks who are doing this for research purposes. So we are always happy to say, to talk with folks individually about their specific research question and say, oh, I'm actually studying, this type of cancer in these people. How should I present this? Or am I correctly selecting the cohort, that I want in the cohort builder correctly? we can kind of talk a little bit about those nuances. The challenge is that it is, a little bit nuanced depending on what the research question is and in each component. So part of it, I think, is first just having a baseline awareness that sex is different from gender, and that once you have that, which is, many times you'll look at table ones in papers and they say, sometimes they say sex, and sometimes they say gender, and sometimes they say man woman, and sometimes they say male female, and sometimes and it's all kind of convoluted. And so starting to have a little more uniformity about how we're presenting things and the language that we're using to talk about them, I think is an important first step. And then but we're happy to have individual conversations with folks. Juno, I don't know if you know of any other specific resources that help people with this.
I mean, there are a number of resources depending on your discipline. I think, if you're more coming at it from the clinical perspective and then into research versus if you're coming a little more at the data elements piece, the National Academies of Science and Medicine has put out a recent report about sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex assigned at birth measures. And in that, they give a lot of resources and a lot of the past research that's been done methodologically on these metrics. I'm actually very proud to say that the AOU is actually ahead in many ways of their recommendations because they're trying to shore up sort of all of research there. But there's a lot of resources in our other hat, which was mentioned very early on. Mitch and I are co-directors of a much smaller project than AOU called the Pride Study, which is an LGBTQ plus focused cohort. Or entirely LGBTQ plus. So that can be checked out at www.pridestudy.org, and some of our research, which is all LGBTQ plus all the time, but certainly reaching out to us. And I just want to say I'm really privileged to note that many of our team members are on the call who are what makes PrideNet possible, Pride Study, but all of the work that we do with the All of Us research program. It's certainly not just the two of us. There's a huge and incredibly fantastic team with a lot of different expertise. But particularly in community engagement and community engaged research across the spectrum. So thank you all for your kind attention here.